Well, it's great to be here in Vermont, one of my favorite states, and especially on a day like this because we don't see this much in Baltimore during the hot, steamy summer months. That opening video was fabulous, and I'm just going to focus in on one small part of it, and that is the impact of the high-meat American diet on our personal health, on the health of the environment, and our moral and ethical obligation to feed the world with that growing population that Secretary Ross mentioned. So first, the average American now consumes about 200 pounds of meat a year. And I know this group of educated and informed foodies is shaking your heads and thinking, that's not me. But as we'll hear later this afternoon from Steve, he was one of the people who had 4 meat portions a day. And that is sadly typical of many Americans. This translates into about a half pound of meat per day. And the recommended daily allotment or allowance for a healthy diet by our own USDA, which on the one hand is pushing American agriculture, pork exports to China, beef exports all over the world, still the other part of the USDA says this is what a healthy diet should look like. And we're exceeding that by 1.5 times. Our diet, in addition to excess calories and fat, includes a lot of hidden ingredients. These hidden ingredients end up in the food that we consume. Now, I've used the broiler chicken because every hour in the United States, we kill and consume 1 million broilers. 24/7, 52 weeks a year. Adds up to just under 8 billion, with a B, broilers consumed in the U.S. each year. Now, part of the feathers that come from those 8 billion birds, it's chopped up, steam hydrolyzed to break down some sulfide bonds that make keratin, our hair, fingernails, and chicken feathers, inedible, indigestible, and that steam hydrolyzed chopped up feather meal goes back into animal feed. It feeds the pigs and the feedlot cows and the broiler chickens. This allows certain toxins to be bioaccumulated, things like arsenic and various pharmaceuticals. Below the feather meal, we have that nondescript pile. That is rendered offal and trimmings from slaughterhouses around the country that also goes into animal feed. And in fact, chicken litter, the mixture of poop and sawdust and wood chips and so forth, that gets fed to our cows and our pigs. Pretty disgusting. At the bottom, we have a lot of pills. And all of them end up in these meat products that come out of our industrialized food animal system. Now, antibiotic resistance, which was mentioned in the video, every year we have about 3.5 or 3.3 million kilograms of antibiotics prescribed in human medicine. And I've done a lot of that prescribing myself as a general internist. It's a lot of medicine, but it's mostly, should be exclusively used to treat disease. I suspect maybe one of you has at one time or another had a viral infection and put pressure on your doctor to prescribe some ampicillin or some Cipro and so forth, and sadly we still do it inappropriately. But most of it's used right. Contrast that with industrial food animal production. 13 million kilograms of antibiotic every year, and almost all of it is used for growth promotion and at subtherapeutic levels for prophylaxis because of the filth and squalor in which our industrial food animal system produces the meat we eat. Now, a quick refresher on nutrition. You probably all know that a gram of carbohydrate is about 4 calories, a gram of protein is 4 calories, and a gram of fat is 9 calories. And herein lies the tragedy from a health perspective of a high meat diet. 3 months ago, a colleagues at the School of Public Health at Harvard University and the Brigham and Women's Hospital published a very, very sobering account of two big studies. One is the health professionals study, and the other is the nurses' health study. And I was a participant in the health professionals study way back when we were looking at the value of an alternate day aspirin therapy or beta-carotene as chemoprophylaxis for cardiovascular disease and cancers. And it was established that low-dose aspirin is a really good thing to take on a regular basis under your doctor's supervision to prevent and mitigate some of the problems with cardiovascular disease. These two large groups of populations, about 45,000 health professionals, mostly doctors, and about 70,000 nurses, have been followed for up to 28 years, 2.9 million person years of follow-up. Now this graph, you're probably saying, that's not too impressive, that's a very shallow slope. But what it really means is that for each additional portion of meat you take in, you increase your all-cause mortality risk by about 1.2, the hazard ratio. This is from the women in the nurses study. This is from the men, mostly men, in the health professionals follow-up study. The MarbleBeat in the background are the confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals for the results. In practical terms, here's how it translates. By substituting just one meat portion per day with nuts, legumes, low-fat dairy, chicken, interestingly, you would have a 9 to 17% reduction in your risk of all-cause mortality. That is impressive. As a public health person, when I see numbers like that, I think this is a huge opportunity. Put another way, if every person in this cohort that's being studied reduced their meat consumption to 1/2 of a meat portion per day, that's about 42 grams or about 1.5 ounces. Now you know that the ideal size of a meat portion is about the size of a pack of cards. That's a 3-ounce portion of meat. That's what the USDA says is one meat portion. Envision getting by on 1/2 of a pack of cards of meat for the typical meat lover. Sounds like too big a hill to climb, doesn't it? But if everybody in this cohort were able to do that, there would be a 9.3% reduction in deaths among the men and a 7.8% reduction in deaths among the women when they followed this cohort through to the end of the study. Those are huge numbers. And as we heard, the type 2 diabetes epidemic that's sweeping the country, the obesity epidemic, all of those are also impacted by cutting back on our meat. Now, the impact of our high meat diet on farmers and communities and our neighbors and the environment are also significant issues. So here, 310 million Americans now, we produce 7 million dry tons of waste per year. About 4 million of that dry tons goes back onto our land as fertilizer after it's been treated in sewage treatment plants and after it's been dried and so forth. Contrast this with the amount of animal waste produced by raising over 8 billion industrial food animals for human consumption every year. 287 million dry tons. Number. And about 270 million goes back on our farmland, untreated, carrying pathogens, bacteria, viruses that can impact human health, impact the health of the environment, destroy the ecosystem, lead to algal blooms, and so forth. Now, this is a pretty disgusting film clip, but it makes an important point. A hog farm dumps its raw sewage into a cesspit, and then that gets pumped out and sprayed untreated on farmland. This video was taken in Duplin County, North Carolina. And I spoke to some of the neighbors who lived across the street from one of these hog CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operation. And if the wind was blowing in the wrong way, that liquid manure splattered on the front of their house and on the car parked in the driveway. Now that's an intrusion on community well-being that exceeds most things associated with industrial agriculture. But as an extreme example, it shows how much work we have to do in order to restore balance and harmony in rural communities. I'm going to close now with our future obligation. I'd like to talk about transgenerational ethics. What is our responsibility as consumers of resources today to the world that we're leaving to our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren? We're going to have about 8 billion people by 2025. If everybody adopted the American diet, high in meat, we would only be able to feed about 4 billion. If we're successful in reversing this trend toward higher and higher meat consumption in middle-income countries and even urban elites in low-income countries, and get back to a plant-based grain diet with appropriate small amounts of animal products, especially the non-fat dairy, we could feed 10 billion. That's a safety margin of 2 billion. And we need that safety margin given the realities of climate change, the challenges of water scarcity, erosion of soils, and some of the other things you've heard today. So we need to learn, we need to engage, and we need to reform our practices. These photos of a farmer's market, of a community co-op garden in Lexington, Massachusetts, and of a community food security meeting in urban Baltimore are just some of the ways in which all of us can help make a better food system. One of the projects that we're very involved with is called the Meatless Monday campaign. How many of you have heard of Meatless Monday? Great. Well, a colleague and friend, Sid Warner, who is a retired madman, he did the Squeeze the Charmin ad back in my youth. He said to me back in 2002, you know, during the war, Second World War, First World War, we had meatless days in order to save food for the troops. We ought to have meatless days in order to save our own health. And Meatless Monday has a nice alliterative ring to it. It turned out that Surgeon General David Satcher, in 2000, when he issued the Healthy People Goals for the Nation Objectives for 2010, said we should reduce the intake of saturated fat by 15% by 2010. Now, how many of us at 21 meals a week could figure out here's 15% of the saturated fat on my plate, I'm going to set it aside? None of us could do that, not even a dietitian. But 15% is about 1 day a week. And since almost all the saturated fat comes from meat, give it up 1 day a week, you've met the Surgeon General's goal for a Healthy America 2010. The goal was not met. We need to reset our clocks and reset our determination for 2020. But it is something that's catching on, and we hope it will get people thinking not just about reducing meat, but about all of the other ways in which a lower meat diet is good for our health, good for our neighbors, good for agriculture, and good for the ecosystem. Thanks very much.